Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we'll be exploring the idea of sovereignty, specifically through like a philosophical lens for our listeners.
Yeah, that's right. Sovereignty is a really rich topic for anybody interested in philosophy because it kind of gets at those big questions
Yeah.
about, power and authority, even the nature of the state. It's all connected.
And to help us kind of unpack all of this, we're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on sovereignty. It was updated in 2024, so it's pretty recent. And we'll be covering a lot of ground today. Everything from how the idea of sovereignty evolved historically to the big thinkers who, wrestled with it.
Yeah, we'll even look at how sovereignty is being challenged in the modern world. I think for someone with a philosophical mind, you'll find the ethical and political implications particularly interesting.
Okay, so I guess first things first, what exactly are we talking about when we say sovereignty?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia starts with a basic definition. They say it's supreme authority within a territory. But as you might imagine, it gets a lot more complicated than that. Each part of that definition, authority, supremacy, territory, has been debated and reinterpreted throughout history.
All right, so let's break it down. When we say authority, what does that actually mean? It's not just about like raw power.
You got it. It's not just about force. Authority needs legitimacy. It means that the power to command and enforce rules is accepted by the people who are being governed. And that acceptance can come from different places: tradition, religious beliefs, a social contract, or sometimes just the practical need for some kind of order.
So it's like a ruler can have a huge army, but they also need people to believe that, they actually have the right to rule.
Exactly. And then there's the supremacy part of the definition that really emphasizes the hierarchy that's built into the idea of sovereignty. It means that within a specific territory, the sovereign power is above every other power. It's the final decision maker.
And then, of course, there's the territory aspect. A sovereign power rules over a particular geographic area.
Right, that's key. And this idea of territory is really important for understanding how sovereignty emerged. It marks a shift away from earlier forms of authority, where power was often more spread out and overlapping. Like, think about medieval times with the church and feudal lords.
So sovereignty helped create those clear boundaries we see between states today. But how did things actually change? How do we go from that more diffuse system to this idea of supreme power within a territory?
Well, it was a gradual process, of course, but the Stanford Encyclopedia points to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 as a really important moment. It's often seen as the birth of the modern sovereign state system.
So Westphalia was like this big sovereignty revolution.
Not quite a revolution, more like a culmination of trends that had been developing for centuries. The encyclopedia highlights things like the Peace of Augsburg back in 1555. That's when princes got the right to choose the religion of their own territories, which, chipped away at the church's power. And then you have the 30 Years' War, which was devastating. It weakened both the Holy Roman Empire and the church's influence.
So you're saying that as these older transnational powers declined, it created space for this idea of the sovereign state to take hold.
Exactly. After Westphalia, you see states with their defined territories and this claim to supreme authority becoming the major players in Europe. They had the power to govern their own internal affairs without interference from outside forces.
Okay, so Westphalia was a huge step in solidifying this idea of the sovereign state. But the Stanford Encyclopedia does mention that some scholars don't quite agree about its significance.
That's right. There's debate about whether some elements of state sovereignty existed even before Westphalia, and of course, some international hierarchies continued after it. It's a really complex historical process, not just like a sudden shift.
So it's more of an evolution than a sudden revolution. But Westphalia was a crucial turning point. Now, I think our philosophically minded listener is probably wondering about the thinkers who grappled with this idea of sovereignty. Where do we even start?
Well, even before the word sovereignty was widely used, you have thinkers like Machiavelli and Martin Luther. They were already thinking about the implications of having a supreme power within a territory.
Machiavelli always seems to get people talking. What did he have to say about this?
Yeah, Machiavelli was writing in the early 16th century, and he didn't actually use the term sovereignty, but his ideas about raison d'etat, that's the idea that the state's well-being is the ultimate goal, even above traditional morality, that really laid some of the groundwork for later justifications of sovereign power.
So he's basically saying the state's survival trumps everything else.
You could put it that way. Machiavelli thought that a ruler had to be pragmatic, even ruthless, to maintain order and security. This focus on the state's interests, above all else, was definitely a step toward our modern concept of sovereignty.
So we've got Machiavelli, very much about realpolitik, about power. What about Martin Luther? He's most famous for the Reformation, but how does that connect to sovereignty?
Yeah, Luther's impact wasn't just about religion. He argued that spiritual and temporal authority should be separate, basically taking power from the Catholic Church and giving it to secular rulers.
So he was giving a kind of theological thumbs up to the idea of sovereign states.
In a way, yes. By challenging the church's dominance, he removed a big obstacle to the development of sovereign states. Princes were much freer to rule without interference from the Pope.
It's amazing how these seemingly unrelated events all feed into political thought, right? So we've got Machiavelli talking about the state's interest, Luther kind of sidelining the church. Where do we go from there?
That's when you start to see thinkers like Jean Baudin and Thomas Hobbes coming into the picture. They really formalized the concept of sovereignty, giving it a more precise definition, a real philosophical framework.
Okay, so they're bringing the term sovereignty into the spotlight. What were their main arguments?
Well, Baudin was writing in the late 16th century during a time of a lot of religious conflict in France, and he saw sovereignty as like the key to stability and order. He defined it as a supreme power within a territory. But it's important to note that for Baudin, this power was still bound by natural and divine law, even though it wasn't limited by any human laws within that territory.
So even the sovereign has limits, but they come from a much higher authority.
Exactly. And then you have Hobbes, writing in the mid-17th century during the English Civil War. He had a slightly different take on it. He thought that in a state of nature, humans would always be at war with each other, driven by their own self-interest.
That's a pretty bleak view of human nature.
It is, but his solution was the social contract. People agree to give up some of their freedom and submit to an absolute sovereign. He called it the Leviathan. And they do this in exchange for security and order.
So for Hobbes, sovereignty wasn't just like practical, it was almost like a necessary evil to prevent chaos.
Exactly. He believed that only an absolute sovereign could prevent society from collapsing into anarchy. So you see how Machiavelli, Luther, Baudin, and Hobbes, they all contributed in their own ways to the development of this idea of sovereignty.
It's really amazing to see how these ideas that emerged from such turbulent times have had such a lasting impact. I mean, they're still shaping how we understand power and authority today.
And keep in mind, we've just scratched the surface here. The story of sovereignty definitely doesn't end there. Just like historical events and philosophical debates shaped its rise, there are new challenges and critiques that are causing it to evolve.
This is getting really interesting. I'm ready to hear more about how sovereignty is being challenged. Let's take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll explore how sovereignty is being reinterpreted in the modern world. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground already. You know, this idea of sovereignty, this supreme authority within a territory, it has really deep philosophical roots. But it sounds like the story doesn't end there, right? How has this concept kind of evolved, especially with all the challenges in the modern world?
Yeah, you're right. Sovereignty has been on quite a journey. And the 20th century, especially after World War II, things really started to shift. People started to re-examine these traditional ideas of absolute sovereignty.
Yeah, I can imagine how, the atrocities of the war would make people question the idea that states can have unlimited power.
Right, Bear?
What were some of the big developments that challenged this idea of sovereignty?
Well, one of the most significant shifts, and the Stanford Encyclopedia really emphasizes this, is the emergence of human rights. This idea that every single person has inherent rights, no matter their nationality or what their government is doing. It's a really important shift in thinking.
So it's like even if a state claims absolute sovereignty, there are still limits on what they can do to their own people, right? Like there's this higher moral authority.
Exactly. The idea is that human rights transcend national borders. It challenges that notion that a state has total power over its citizens.
That's a pretty powerful concept. But how did human rights actually start to challenge state sovereignty in like a real practical way?
Well, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 was a big turning point. It wasn't legally binding, but it did set a global standard. It was like a blueprint for a whole bunch of human rights treaties and conventions that followed.
It sounds like it was a big wake-up call for the world.
You could say that. And it led to some more concrete legal mechanisms, like you have the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, which actually does have enforcement mechanisms, and the Genocide Convention in 1948, which of course was a direct response to the horrors of the Holocaust.
So states were increasingly being held accountable for how they treated their own people, even if that meant, limiting their own sovereignty.
You got it. This idea that sovereignty comes with responsibilities, not just powers, That really started to take hold. The Stanford Encyclopedia even mentions something called the responsibility to protect, or R2P. This emerged in 2001, and it basically says that if a state fails to protect its own citizens from harm, the international community has a responsibility to step in.
Wow, that's a huge shift from the idea of non-intervention that came out of Westphalia.
It really is, and I think it shows how dynamic sovereignty is as a concept. It changes with circumstances and, with our evolving sense of morality.
Okay, so we've got human rights limiting state power from within. But what about other challenges, especially in this globalized world?
Well, globalization itself is a huge force reshaping the whole idea of sovereignty. The world's so interconnected now with trade, communication technologies, even things like climate change. It's getting harder and harder for states to act like totally independent entities.
Like those global problems are too big for any one state to handle on its own.
Exactly. And the Stanford Encyclopedia also points to the rise of these non-state actors. We're talking about international organizations like the UN, NGOs like Amnesty International, Doctors Without Borders, even multinational corporations that operate across borders.
So these are groups that aren't bound by the traditional rules of sovereignty, but they still have a huge impact on the world.
Exactly. They're shaping global norms, they're influencing policy. Sometimes they're even providing services that used to be the responsibility of states. Like, think about the role of NGOs in humanitarian aid. They often operate in places where the state has completely failed to protect its people.
So we've got human rights challenging sovereignty from within, and globalization and these non-state actors challenging it from outside. What does it all mean for the future of sovereignty?
That's the big question. And as you can imagine, philosophers have had a lot to say about the limits and potential pitfalls of sovereignty. The Stanford Encyclopedia actually highlights some really insightful critiques.
I'd love to hear about those. Who are some of the philosophers who've really pushed back against this traditional view of sovereignty?
Well, two thinkers who come to mind are Bertrand de Jouvenel and Jacques Maritain. They both offered really powerful critiques of sovereignty, though from different angles.
Okay, let's start with Juvenal. What were his main concerns about sovereignty?
Well, Juvenal was writing in the mid-20th century, and he acknowledged that sovereignty was necessary, at least to some degree, for keeping things stable. But he was really wary of absolute power. He was especially concerned about this idea that the sovereign's will is the only source of law and morality.
So it's not enough for a sovereign to just say, because I said so. They need a better reason, a moral foundation for their actions.
That's exactly it. Juvenal believed that morality exists independently, and that a sovereign should be guided by higher principles. He argued that society needs to have a shared moral understanding, and that can act as a check on the sovereign's power.
So it's like a kind of ethical checks and balances system for sovereignty.
Mhm.
Interesting. What about Maritain? How did he critique this concept?
Maritain went even further. He actually argued that the whole concept of sovereignty is flawed. He saw it as a form of idolatry, where the state or the ruler gets elevated to a position of absolute authority. They become disconnected from the people they're supposed to represent.
He's saying that sovereignty creates too much distance between the ruler and the ruled.
Right. And he saw this as a real threat to democracy and to the idea of a global order. He believed that sovereignty was getting in the way of developing international law and a true global community, which he felt were essential for peace and justice.
So Maritain is calling for a pretty fundamental rethink of how we organize ourselves politically. It's really interesting how these philosophical critiques actually reflect the real-world challenges to sovereignty that we were just talking about, like human rights and globalization.
Absolutely. And this whole debate about the nature and limits of sovereignty, it's still going strong. Even within the Catholic tradition, which Maritain was a part of, there's a lot of discussion about balancing sovereignty with the responsibility to protect human rights.
It seems like the legacy of those early thinkers, Bodin and Hobbes, it's still shaping our world. But now it's being reinterpreted and challenged in light of all these new ethical and political realities.
Exactly. And that's why understanding the history and philosophy of sovereignty is so crucial. It's not just some abstract idea. It really shapes how we live, the choices we make as individuals, and as a global community.
So where do we go from here? After this deep dive into sovereignty, how do we even begin to deal with this concept in the 21st century?
That's a perfect question to lead us into our final thoughts. Let's take a look at some potential paths forward for this idea of sovereignty, especially as we face these unprecedented challenges in our increasingly interconnected world.
Wow. It's incredible to think about how far we've come. We started with these medieval power structures, then we talked about the rise of the modern state, and now it seems like the whole idea of sovereignty is being questioned, both practically and philosophically. It's almost like the rules of the game are changing right in front of us.
Yeah, it's definitely a dynamic process, and it's happening right now, all around us. The Stanford Encyclopedia actually points to a few key trends that are really reshaping how we think about sovereignty. And these trends have a very real impact on, how you and I experience the world, how we live our lives.
Okay, I'm really curious. What are some of these trends that are like actively reshaping sovereignty? It feels like globalization has to be a huge part of it. I mean, everything's so interconnected now, right?
Absolutely, you're right on the money there. Globalization is making it harder and harder to say what's domestic and what's international. It's like the lines are getting blurred. Think about it. Economic interdependence, the fact that we're all connected through these global communication networks, even something like climate change. These are all issues that just can't be solved by one country acting alone.
Right. It's like those problems are too big to fit neatly inside the borders of any single state.
Exactly. And that's driving this need for new ways of cooperating, for new kinds of global governance. Like, take the Paris Agreement on climate change. That requires states to work together to reduce emissions, even if it means that some countries might have to limit their own economic growth in the short term.
So even those powerful countries are having to, I guess, give up a little bit of their sovereignty to address these global challenges.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And the Stanford Encyclopedia mentions another trend that's kind of tied to globalization, the rise of all these non-state actors. We're talking about things like international organizations like the UN, NGOs like Amnesty International or Doctors Without Borders, even those big multinational corporations that operate in so many different countries.
Right. These are all groups that don't really play by the traditional rules of sovereignty, but they still have a lot of power and influence.
Absolutely. They're shaping global norms, they're impacting policy decisions, even providing services that, in the past were always handled by states. Like, think about the work that NGOs do in humanitarian relief efforts. A lot of times they're stepping in where states have failed to protect their own citizens.
It's a fascinating picture, but definitely a complicated one. So where do you see all of this going? What do you think the future holds for this idea of sovereignty in such a fast-changing, interconnected world?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, the Stanford Encyclopedia doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but they do outline some possible scenarios. Some scholars think we're moving toward what they call fragmented sovereignty, where states still control some areas, but they're giving up authority to, like, regional or global institutions in other areas.
So it's almost like a patchwork of sovereignty, right? Where different actors are responsible for different things.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And then there are others who envision an even bigger shift, where the idea of the sovereign state itself just kind of fades away, and we see it replaced by some new forms of global governance. Of course, that's a really controversial idea, and nobody knows for sure if it'll ever actually happen.
Well, it's both exciting and a little bit intimidating to think about all the possibilities, right? After this deep dive into sovereignty, I keep coming back to this idea that maybe we're at a turning point. Like, we're seeing a fundamental shift in how we think about power and authority in the world.
Yeah, I think that's a really insightful observation. And the truth is, nobody knows exactly what the outcome of this shift will be. It depends on the choices that we make, the values that we prioritize, and, how we decide to organize ourselves as a global community.
It's definitely given me a lot to think about. I want to thank the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for giving us so much great material for this deep dive. And of course, thank you for, guiding us through this really complex topic. It's been amazing.
The pleasure was all mine. It's been a really stimulating conversation.
And to all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on the deep dive as we explore the fascinating world of sovereignty. We hope you've come away with a better understanding of how this concept has shaped our past, how it continues to shape our present, and how important it will be in shaping our future. And before we go, we want to leave you with one final thought. If you could redesign the entire global system from scratch, how would you balance the need for order and stability with the demands for justice, for human rights, and for global cooperation? It's something to think about.